I want to start as a way of a forecast and a preamble by making this distinction between practice as a noun and as a verb, to practice. It very much the idea of the focus on the doing, okay, of performing and enacting a practice, and that is the concern that I'm particularly interested in, and want to promote here today. So, practicing professional identity is my title, and also my project. There is a little there's a difference you'll note if you've looked at the abstracts. The ambition of my abstract written some months ago, and what's possible in 40-odd minutes. You'd think I'd know better. But also the other issue is when you come last in a conference, you actually have the pleasure and the privilege of hearing from others, both the keynotes and the sessions I've been able to attend, and of course you learn and it mucks things up. So I'm trying not to move too far away from what I have prepared. However, they've mucked with my head. You've mucked with my head. Now, where I'm coming from, I wanted to speak, give a little bit of introduction, a little bit of time in the introduction to what Francesca talked about, which is the Research Institute for Professional Practice, Learning and Education, Ripple. Sometimes when I've been overseas and say I'm from Ripple, there's a kind of a snigger at that point, and I've never been able to understand it. I have been involved for over a decade with Ripple in various incarnations, and it's been a centrepiece for my own intellectual scholarly project and the work of a number of my colleagues, some of whom are here. We developed what I think is a distinctive and robust and generative research program addressed to the notion of understanding and researching professional practice, and particularly organised by what I prefer to call practice theory and philosophy. Okay. It's also been addressed to the whole question of professions and professionalism, with a particular emphasis on the new and emerging professions, because of course that's what at CSU has been characteristic of our work. Historically, though that's changing somewhat, we're still focusing on that, but there are other sorts of fields that are starting to come into play. A visual representation of that research program, when we put this one together, we thought this one would certainly have a life of 5 to 10 and really longer. But circumstances always change, and it's probably fair to say that this is no longer as systematic and focused a research program as it was, though I still think it's generative and it's useful to look at what we were endeavouring to do. The centrepiece, reconceptualising practice, problematizing, thematising practice, and particularly professional practice, and then notions of practice development across the professional career, practice in multiple contexts, learning, practice and change, and some of you will know a book that came out last year edited by Paul Hager, Alison Leonanne Wright, called Practice, Learning and Change. There was a number of CSU participants in that. It was part of the ongoing dialogue. And over here, Professional Identities and Cultures, Subjectivity, the Space, the Body and Space. So you know, I particularly was interested in this conference because it seemed to me as if this was a way of continuing that research program, and this conference and also the book that's proposed to come from it, raising very much notions of practice, culture, and identity. What is it to be and become a professional? This is from our Ripple's website, and also its, if you like, its statement. What is it to belong to profession? How are professional identities formed and sustained? What is it to be known as and to see oneself as a practicing professional? What is it more specifically to be a professional in a particular field? A nurse, a doctor, a lawyer, a social worker, and so on. How are professional identities constructed both at the outset in the context of pre-service professional education and subsequently throughout the professional career? Now that, I think, to some extent speaks to what I've heard going on at this conference. Some people talking about the initial phase of professional education, some talking about the transitional phase, some focused on the continuing phase. And of course it's all of a whole, ideally, though often institutionally it's not as easy to do that. For this work is the notion of rethinking practice, the concept, and drawing upon what I call practice theory and philosophy. I was very pleased to hear Rainer's critique, was it just yesterday, because I think one of the things is that though I find Shasky's work very generative, I think there's been a tendency not to critique it, all right? And not to extend it in various sorts of ways. And I do think the analysis that Rainer did is appropriate, that it is more tied to what used to be called reproduction than appears to be the case on the face of it. One of the issues here is the notion of picking up on common sense, all right? Common sense in the sense that practice is one of those terms which is always in the area for us. But my feeling is that it's rarely problematized as a concept. It's rarely interrogated as a concept. And that's extremely important to do, it seems to me. And as I'll go on to suggest, other related concepts like identity, the concepts which, as in Bourdieu's sense, seem to give themselves to us, seem to be lying readily at hand in this kind of milieu. They're the ones to be, if you like, vigilant against, all right? Because they claim us in a certain kind of way. This is Bourdieu's notion of doxa. That's important. So the issue here of theorizing practice, problematizing, thematizing it, and thinking very much about that affecting related terms. But the primacy of practice as the primary generic social thing, as Shatsky talked about early. I was going to leave this slide out, but I just sort of decided that I would bring it back in because it is important, and I think if we listen to the recordings of the conference, practice has been used in very different ways, okay? We've managed the conversation, we've managed our interaction, but I think if we look carefully, we'll see that we're using it in different senses, okay? One sense, the work of the world, Shasky talks about involvement in political and or economic affairs, in the everyday life of the professions, the occupations. For some, the real world, or where the rubber hits the road. Okay. Somewhere there lurking is that old shibboleth of the theory-practice relationship. And again, you know, a binary construct that traps us as much as, you know, helps us in various sorts of ways. Those, some of you know Shatsky very well, I know, that these kinds of notions, the second dot put, very crucial to his theory, a temporally unfolding and spatially dispersed nexus of doings and sayings. Fundamentally, what is a practice? Doings and sayings in interrelations. Stephen Chemist has brought in relatings. One of my doctoral students has started to think about makings. He's working with arts-based research, art as practice. So time, space, situatedness, duration, certainly on a number of scales. But also the idea of performance, of performing an action, or carrying out this nexus of doings and sayings. And also, if you like, one that kind of trails the idea of practice as in, you know, practicing the piano or a musical instrument or a sport. You know, learning to become a professional or a practitioner in whatever field. Learning how or improving one's ability to do something by repeatedly working at it and carrying it out. The realm of professional education, certainly initial and what I call transitional professional education, but arguably something that, you know, carries through the professional career. And this one involving notions of training, of repetition, of you know, creating and encouraging that certain kinds of things become habitual. They become automatic. Okay, they move below the threshold of awareness, as it were, and they become the resources upon which one depends in order to carry out the work of our fields in various sorts of ways. There are a range of other attempts to discriminate between different uses of practice, but I think that those at least are useful. And the thing here is also to be thinking about how professional education in that preparatory phase and the other of those three bottom points, dot points on the bottom, how they come together, how they play off each other, how they work in various sorts of ways. My actual focus, and I have to say here, you know, I have to acknowledge my own unease with the very concept of professional identity and with identity talk more generally. That's partly a matter of politics and partly a matter of philosophy. I think there are a lot of, if you like, praxis traps along the way with notions of identity, particularly if I'm right in that identity is one of those concepts which gives itself to us rather too easily. Philosophically, the privileging of identity over difference, and I'm thinking about the argument of Derrida and the metaphysics of presence, the notion that identities historically and in the history of metaphysics have been privileged over difference in various sorts of ways. So I think that kind of philosophical context is really important. One of the issues for me is that identity is all too often subject to thinking in terms of psychology and epistemology. Knowledge of a particular kind or understood in a particular way, and minds, the privileging of mind over body. And I might say here that the book I'm working on with Nick Hopwood from UTS and colleagues is about thinking the body in professional practice in various sorts of ways. Without rejecting epistemology or psychology, certainly wanting to unsettle the fact that this, the complicity with, as it were, common sense. And this raises the issue of, for me, whether identity is the term that takes us very, very far, or whether it is the notion of subjectivity, which I draw from post-structuralist theory and philosophy in its various manifestations and generations. The idea of subjectivity is constituted in and through discourse, or discourses, but I think an important development is thinking about that, rethinking that body of work, which is, after all, not new, but also relating it to subjectivity as constituted in and through practices. And the relationship here of discourses and practices, and even an early term of Foucault and Foucaultian scholarship, discourse practice, with a hyphen, which seemed to disappear in various sorts of ways, but I think it's been interesting, or at least I've found it interesting, to start to think about practice theory, which is a kind of a meta theory, a larger grab for a whole body of theories with at least a family resemblance. Okay, subjectivity is constituted in and through discourses and practices. Now, I've got a quote there from Margaret Wetherill, whose work some of you will know. In this article, she talks about any complete account of lived lives needs to include both identity and subjectivity, and I think that's fair enough in terms of the argument. She's quoting Koos Venn, and some of you will remember that Venn was a member of the team that produced Changing the Subject in 1984, which I think is a really important account of the notion of subjectivity as related to formations of knowledge, power, discourse, and ideology. In terms of researching professional identity, Francesca and colleagues did a very, very good job of looking at through the higher education literature and a literature review of the field, and talking about the 2 points that struck me: the underdevelopment of the research base for professional identity development formation, and what was missing in the literature was a focus on professional identity development informed by clearly articulated understandings of professional identity. And I'm not really surprised by that. In the light, though I am, I'm pleased to have it confirm my hypothesis that identity is one of those notions that gives itself to us in various sorts of ways, and we need to be careful about it. Francesca and Selena have continued their exploration, partly bouncing off that literature review, and they come up with a more complex and layered notion of professional identity, as formed as a tripartite sense, formed one of three different cells. And bear in mind, what do we mean by identity? We're talking about self, we're talking about individual, we're talking about notions like agency and so on. Okay? One of three different cells: a coherent, consistent core self, a socially constructed relational self, and a fragmented, constantly reforming through dialogue self. Now that paper on the critical professional chapter actually, I do recommend, because I think it is a rich and sophisticated conceptualization. But from my angle, I worry about the notion of the core self as coherent and consistent. It seems to me that even though there is this, it's like, I think, a number of people wanting to resist the sense of working with a unitary notion of the self, okay? But at the same time, we buttress it, or we anchor it by some notion of a core self that is consistent and coherent. A socially constructed self, relationally formed, and a more processual subject, a self in process, a self in play, as it were. Now, what I think actually is needed here to be thinking about some of these notions is some psychoanalysis and post-structuralist theory of subjectivity, and often through a feminist lens, which seems to me have been extremely generative in demonstrating, in arguing and demonstrating the fragility of the self, the vulnerability of the self, the whole question of the subject as constructed, that holds together in various sorts of ways, but is constantly at risk. Now, that may just be me, but I think a reading of some of the psychoanalytic literature in education, as well as in other places like Deborah Britzman, is very sobering. That in various sorts of ways, the formation of identity, the establishment of identity, the duration, the maintenance of identity is quite a fraught business. At the very least, it introduces the notion of conflict and dynamism into the process, and it helps us to think a little bit more carefully about the notion of stability. Okay. Now, this raises some interesting issues, I think, for us, is about the relationship between the inside and the outside, between notion of professional identity. Is that referencing the identity of a profession, what it is, and how do I, as a member, hopefully, of this profession, of a profession, how do I identify with? Okay, how do I identify as? So again, and Raina referred to this term the other day, the notion of identification processes or identification practices becomes extremely important. And I want to think here in particular about what other resources are available to take our thinking in this area further. Higher education was the focus of that review. One of the fields that I think has done some really interesting work, and this is a case where there should be more dialogue, is in teacher education. A whole range of work around identity, practice and narrative. And I'm thinking, for instance, with regard to narrative, the work of Polkinghorne, who some of you would know, using Bourdieu to think about practice, and Sean, of course, but also thinking about narratives as ways of representing and self-representing practices. In teacher education, a range of papers, this is just one of them, from Kate Watson. The importance of a concept of professional identity lies in the assumption that who we are, who we think we are, influences what we do. i.e. there's a link between professional identity and professional action. In a sense, professional action is doing professional identity. When we are acting in our profession, performing the profession as it were, we are also forming and reforming our professional identities. Watson presents some rather interesting accounts in her paper, and I think there's a range of things that we could usefully use in thinking about the professions, work in professional education in this context. I point out that notion of who we think we are, who we are, who we think we are. One of the things that I've been particularly concerned with was thinking about two or perhaps three traditions in what I call practice theory and philosophy. The Neo-Aristotelian, for whom McIntyre is a reference point, but the American pragmatist tradition through Dewey and James, Rorty to some extent, but also what I call the post-Cartesian, post-Descartes. It was interesting, where's Monica? Yes. It was interesting to see that the computer program called Descartes this morning. The post-Cartesian, for me, is particularly drawing attention to the whole problem of subjectivity, the constituted nature of subjectivity, on the other hand, the problematization of representation and indeed realism. Just to remind ourselves, Descartes' famous aphorism was, "I think, therefore I am." And that whole, that statement itself symbolizes a history of the dominance of a particular kind of disembodied mind, of rationality. And I think this actually gets back to what is the rationalities that inform the university. And someone was talking about this the other day, and I was thinking of Schon's notion of practice epistemologies challenging the technical rationalist in thinking about the modern university. Who we think we are. Okay. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I do. And the consequences that play out in common sense, the Cartesian legacy, is really, really evident in so many of our spheres. Watson quotes Deborah Cameron, the linguist Deborah Cameron. It's not because of some essential core that we behave as we do, rather it is by acting in a particular way that we construct our identity. You know? Nietzsche, in the beginning, was the deed. And I think this is I would call this a practice theoretical view, the idea of practice producing identity, and even reproducing identity, because that is always a matter of sameness and difference, the dynamic of sameness and difference. The issue I spoke of earlier of identification practices, identifying as, identifying with. And I think someone like Bakhtin is interesting here. Not just the notion of the multi-accentuality of the sign, as he talked about, but let's talk about the self as a sign that is multi-accentuated in various sorts of ways, where various discourses and practices play through the arena of the sign and the self. But also, I think the tension or the negotiation between what he called the authoritative and the internally persuasive. How does this identity with these kinds of action imperatives, how does it become internally persuasive for me as a prospective member of this field and profession? It's a negotiation, but it's also, I suggest, a tension. I say authoritative, not authoritarian. But we also need to be thinking about the way in which, to some extent, you have to give in. This is the way you do things. This is the way things are done. This is the way practice traditions inform us about what is to be done in order to move on. Now, something of an illustration. Recently there's been some really interesting work around practice turn in teacher education, and I was very interested in Monica's presentation this morning because I can see lots of connections and similarities with the work that we've been doing at Charles Sturt. This is from Pamela Grossman. Some of you will know her. Teacher education should move away from a curriculum focused on what teachers need to know to a curriculum organised around core practices, in which knowledge, skill and professional identity are developed in the process of learning to practice. Learning to practice. I think Grossman actually is open to the critique around her notion of practice in various sorts of ways. We've had that discussion. This is a pedagogy of enactment where the core practices, which have to be discerned anyway, are brought, however transformed, within the space of the university and the campus, okay, and worked through repeatedly. Same with nursing. What are the core practices of nursing? What are the core practices of social work and so on? How do we decide upon them? What do they look like transformed into curriculum? In other words, the representation problem in curriculum. And how do we build upon a pedagogy of enactment which relates and runs alongside our pedagogies of reflection, as in reflective practice, such a presentation this morning, pedagogies of observation, pedagogies of apprenticeship and so on. My colleagues in teacher education at Charles Sturt have been working on a project which they call PRAC, Pedagogy, Relationships and Communication. And they have been working in the pre-service program of primary teachers. Student teachers engaging in the practice of core practices of classroom pedagogy, enacting them, performing them, practicing them. Okay, and they've been doing this for 2 or 3 years now, and Marilyn Peach, I think, is here somewhere. Oh, she was performing this morning. Hi, Marilyn. I should actually get Marilyn up here because she's actually been involved in the actual processes. But the idea of, and this is an example of one that I'm interested in, from the idea of reading aloud to kids. I was a secondary English teacher, and one of the things that shocked me was in teacher education was how little prospective English teachers had heard their own voice. So how do you read to a class of year 9s? Right? How do you share this, the experience of story in one way or another? My colleagues have been working in the primary area, and particularly junior primary area. How do you learn to read aloud to a class? Okay, junior primary, etc., etc. Well, they've been going through exercises, and you can talk to Marilyn. And this is actually, I'm not very good at this. Okay, and it's a long time since I've been in the situation. But what do you do? How do you hold the book? Imagine these children around you here. They've got to be close to you. In other words, there's the body. Before this, of course, there's the reading to your own child, which is often here, whatever. And that raises some interesting issues as well. It used to be called the lap method. All right? Now, it's very hard to talk about the lap method in teacher education these days. But the whole idea, and I've seen some videos of this and I've heard the reports and so on, how do these people learn? I mean, what do they do with their legs? What do they wear? okay? Especially what you wear in some cases, right? How do you hold it in such a way that the experience of the book, and you read it, and of course you have to have read it before, don't you? All right? And then how do you develop this? This is actually something that it's not automatic, all right? There's a way of using the body. There's the gaze work, all right? There's the voice, yeah? And there's 3 minutes to go. But you'll see what I'm thinking about here. The idea of learning to read aloud, to be a certain kind of person, to be a certain kind of teacher, it also raises, why is that valuable? Okay, so the reflexive project of becoming a teacher in that way. Let me quickly move on. This raises, it seems to me, questions inevitably thinking about identity, and bearing in mind my comments earlier, about ontology. Not only being whoever, a doctor, a nurse, a social worker, a physiotherapist, but becoming. The becoming, again, the problem with being is that it's, it's also a state. The becomingness of who I am in interaction with these others and the situation. Learning to become professionals entails integrating what aspiring professionals know and can do with who they are becoming, including the challenges, risk, commitment, and resistance that are involved. So, the primacy of practice, prioritising practice, practising, performing, enacting, doing, becoming a professional, a practitioner, becoming somebody, because we forget about the body too often, and the whole issue, therefore, of practising professional identity. Thank you.